I am approaching the topic of this episode from a million miles away in the sense that I've lived my entire 29 years with an abundance of love and support and security, as well as the privilege of blending into my societal surroundings and never fearing for my safety because of the outer shell I was born with. And this is an attempt to contribute to a dialogue that, quite frankly, is an intimidating one to enter because there's a lot of chances to make mistakes. And when speaking about race relations in our country, mistakes can cause a lot of hurt and possible confusion as to where I stand. And this is an incredibly nuanced and delicate subject and difficult subject, but I think we need to be able to risk making mistakes, and we need to be forgiving to those who make them, who are well-intentioned, so that we can broaden this conversation and get more people involved. And if you're listening and something I say makes you angry or seems ill-informed or feels like a misstep in any way, I strongly encourage you to leave a comment explaining why so that we can excavate deeper and continue talking. I've been thinking a lot recently about the idea of prejudice, and I'm distinguishing prejudice from overt racism because I'm not really interested, nor do I think it's particularly helpful to have a dialogue about how to fix racists. If you are somebody who proudly subscribes to the idea that superiority is somehow linked to your ethnic makeup, then all I have to offer you is pity as you slowly but surely piss away your one opportunity for a rich and interesting and colorful life. And that is to say, I don't believe the Jerry Berries of the world are the main problem going on right now, but that instead there's something much more subtle and difficult to defeat going on, which is prejudice. And unfortunately, that's not something that can be abolished. We can write anti-discrimination laws. We can create affirmative action programs. We can invent catchphrases and profess them loudly and passionately in the streets. But there is nothing that can protect you or me from someone's prejudice. Because having personal prejudice is as much of an American right as not being enslaved. But if we can agree that prejudice is a practice that in the long run negatively affects all of us, then we obviously need to discuss possible solutions. And I think a logical place to start is to think about what the opposite of prejudice is. And if you were to simply look up antonyms, you'll come across words that generally mean fairness or impartiality, But I don't think fairness is a solution in the same way I don't believe affirmative action is a solution. It's a well-intentioned idea, but in practice, it's fighting fire with fire to manufacture something that looks like equity but doesn't address the root of the problem. And impartiality is maybe closer to the right idea, but that word has implications of disinterest or detachment, which also doesn't feel right. So after some consideration, I landed on a word that I think has a useful definition in terms of acting as prejudice's opposite, and that word is empathy. I don't believe that we have this malevolent racism problem in our country as much as I think we have an empathy problem. And the common practice associated with empathy is the imagining of walking a mile in another person's shoes. But this can be remarkably easy when that person's shoes and clothing and neighborhood and body language and diction and skin color reflects your own. Being empathetic doesn't take a great deal of effort when you can, in many ways, quite literally see yourself in that person. So we need to be willing to extend and stretch that empathy beyond what's easy and comfortable if we're going to see any real progress. And we need to be willing to engage people whose customs and behaviors and appearance and beliefs and economic status, etc., might be a lot different from yours. And we have to engage these people with curiosity as opposed to fear. Because when you start with curiosity, it means you're listening. It means you're considering their circumstances. It means that you're willing to expend some of your precious and limited time and energy giving somebody from the other side a chance to possibly enrich your life and a chance for you to enrich theirs as well. And of course, you may come to find that this person is someone you don't care for, or perhaps even despise, in which case you can choose to detach. But at least you began from a place that allowed the opportunity for something positive. The catch is that there are deceptive people and ill-intentioned people and hate-filled people in the world who may look to take advantage of your empathy. And being too late to realize this could cost you money or time or ultimately your life. And I think the reality of the latter is likely how our police forces justify training recruits as if they're going to be entering a war zone. Because police culture seemingly has been centered around the idea of seeking out the enemy and bringing them to justice. And in a war zone, empathy equates to vulnerability, and vulnerability equates to death. So we can't treat our communities like war zones. We can't have officers believing that their primary mission is to seek out an enemy And we can't have monetary incentives for bringing people to quote unquote justice. And while there are undoubtedly inherent risks to adopting an empathetic mindset, especially when it's your job to potentially enter these dangerous situations, I think having this mindset needs to be a hallmark of your character and part of the oath you take if you are to be endowed with lethal force and a license to kill people. When I watched the video of George Floyd's murder, I didn't immediately subscribe to the fact that it was a racially charged crime. And that's not because I don't think it would have played out different had George looked and behaved more like Derek Chauvin. I absolutely believe it would have. But I also think it's so important that we allow stories to develop and allow evidence to surface before concluding with absolute certainty that an action was racially charged. Because if we abandon the need for proper evidence and rely on what I feel is a grossly corrupt media and optics alone, we risk only allowing information that fits the narrative that they give us, which isn't a path to progress. But what I can say without a single drop of doubt is that none of the officers involved had a shred of empathy for George Floyd. Least of all, the deranged, disturbed, power-drunk, socially retarded, grossly underqualified coward named Derek Chauvin, who was endowed with lethal force and a license to kill people. So the point of this message, I guess, to anybody listening, and I know this is a very broad stroke perspective and that there are so many factors to consider that haven't been addressed here. What I want to get across is pay attention to your internal reactions and your emotions when you encounter somebody you can't easily identify or empathize with. And try to take a breath and attempt to replace your fear of the unfamiliar with curiosity. And if your curiosity isn't well received, then practice empathy even further by suppressing your instinct to be defensive. Because even though you may be ready to be someone's ally, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're ready to accept you as one. And to be empathetic is to understand why.